The Vigil Collective wasn't like the squishy feeling creatures they were about to watch. The Vigil were beings of pure thought, held together by shared logic and a need for perfect order. Emotions were messy, unpredictable things they had long ago smoothed out of their existence, like wrinkles in fabric. Stability was everything. Their great ship, the Observer, didn't look like a ship to human eyes. It was more like a silent, dark cloud, big enough to swallow mountains whole, that slipped through the space between stars without a ripple. It didn't have windows, just smooth black armor that could turn invisible or change shape if needed. Inside, there were no comfy chairs or kitchens, just humming machines and glowing displays showing numbers, charts, and data streams. Their journey was long, but time meant little to the Vigil. They traveled across the galaxy, finding new worlds, new life. Their goal was simple: observe, understand, categorize. They had seen species made of light, beings who lived in gas clouds, and creatures who communicated through complex patterns of scent. Most species, they noted, had natural ways to stay balanced. They had built-in thermostats for their feelings, or their surroundings helped keep them calm and predictable. Earth was just another dot on their star charts, a small blue marble spinning in a quiet corner of space. Initial scans showed liquid water, a breathable atmosphere, and complex life forms building things on the surface. Interesting, but not unusual. The Observer found a good spot, far out from the planet, but close enough for their sensors to reach. They became a shadow in the void, watching. The Vigil extended their senses towards the blue planet. Their technology was amazing. They could see through walls, listen to tiny whispers miles away, and even detect the subtle energy shifts happening inside living things. They didn't focus on one place at first. They scanned wide areas, looking at cities, forests, oceans, mountains. They saw tall buildings, fast-moving vehicles, and strange light-up screens everywhere. But it was the life forms on the surface that got their main attention. Tiny, quick-moving shapes they identified as the dominant species. Humans. The Vigil began to watch them closely, their minds recording everything, filing away data points about their size, shape, and basic actions. The Vigil watched the humans move about like busy insects on the planet's surface. From their distance, cities looked like complex ant farms. Humans clustered together, built structures, and rushed back and forth. The Vigil's sensors picked up all sorts of signals: communications, energy use, body heat signatures. They saw humans working in fields, gathering in large buildings, or moving in long lines of metal boxes on hard paths. It all seemed very focused, very organized in a basic way, like the construction of a dam by beavers or the building of a hive by bees. There was a clear goal: build, gather, move, survive. But as the Vigil watched more closely, zooming their senses onto individual humans or small groups, they started to notice something strange. Something that didn't fit the simple patterns of work or survival. They saw humans gathered in a brightly lit area. Loud noises and flashing lights were everywhere. Some humans were moving their bodies in quick, jerky ways, while others stood still, making loud sounds with their mouths. The Vigil's sensors read sudden spikes in energy levels within their bodies. Were they fighting? Were they in danger? Then, they watched another group. These humans were sitting quietly around a table, looking at small, flat objects. Their faces were still, their body language calm. The energy readings were low and steady. This seemed more logical, more controlled. But a moment later, one of these quiet humans made a sudden, sharp sound. Their face twisted into a strange shape, and they hit the table hard with their hand. The energy sensors flared red, showing a massive spike. What caused this sudden change? There was no obvious threat, no physical attack. The Vigil cross-referenced their data. They compared the energy spikes and body changes they observed with the actions that followed. They saw humans suddenly laughing loudly, Then minutes later, sitting in silence with water leaking from their eyes, they saw humans yelling with anger, then later holding onto each other tightly. These changes were fast. They seemed to come from inside the humans, not just from things happening around them. And they didn't seem to follow predictable rules. A loud noise might cause fear in one human, excitement in another, or annoyance in a third. The vigil had never seen anything quite like it. Other species reacted to clear dangers or rewards, but these humans seemed to shift their internal state for reasons that weren't obvious or logical. It was the first puzzle piece in their observation, a strange signal in the otherwise ordinary data stream of a new world. They continued to watch, recording every frown, every laugh, every sudden shout. They needed more data to understand these peculiar shifts. The vigil adjusted their sensors, focusing on closer views. They needed to see the details. They watched humans up close, their advanced tech letting them observe without being seen or heard. They saw humans in homes, in public places, and alone. One scene showed a small group of humans gathered around a brightly decorated object. They were making loud, happy sounds. Their faces were stretched into wide smiles, showing teeth. They gave each other objects wrapped in colored paper. This state seemed to be joy, or happiness, based on the energy patterns and sounds. It was intense, but seemed harmless. Minutes later, observing a different location, the vigil saw a human sitting alone. Their body was slumped, their face pulled downwards. They made soft, watery sounds. Energy readings showed a deep, low state. This seemed to be sadness or grief. It looked uncomfortable and draining. Then came a scene that truly confused the vigil. Two humans were standing close together. Their voices were loud and sharp. Their body language was stiff, their hands formed into tight shapes. Energy levels were high, almost volatile. This state seemed to be anger or rage. It looked dangerous, like a storm gathering. The vigil expected physical conflict to follow, as it often did in other species when energy levels spiked like this. But sometimes the humans just kept shouting, and eventually the energy levels dropped without any physical fight. Other times, the shouting did lead to pushing or hitting. It was unpredictable. They observed something called fear. A human would suddenly freeze, their eyes wide, their breathing fast. The cause might be a loud, sudden noise or seeing something unexpected. The energy spike was sharp and immediate. This seemed more logical, a reaction to a potential threat. But the intensity and the duration of the fear seemed to vary wildly, even when the threat seemed similar. And sometimes, humans showed signs of fear even when there was no clear danger at all. Another common state involved quick, excited movements and rapid speech. This seemed to be excitement or anticipation. Humans would jump up and down, clap their hands and make high-pitched sounds. The energy was high, but in a different way than anger. It seemed tied to things that hadn't even happened yet, or to simple things like watching other humans compete in games. The vigil recorded thousands upon thousands of these instances. They noted the different expressions on the humans' faces, the changes in their body posture, the sounds they made, and the internal energy shifts. They created detailed charts and graphs, trying to find the rules governing these states. But the rules were hard to find. The emotional states seemed to shift quickly, sometimes within moments. They didn't always have a clear external cause, and the reaction to a similar cause could be completely different depending on the human, or even the same human at a different time. Joy could turn to anger in an instant. Sadness could be followed by laughter. Calm could explode into fear. This constant, rapid shifting was unlike anything the vigil had systematically observed before. Other species had reactions, of course, but they were usually tied to survival needs, hunger, danger, reproduction. And their internal states tended to be more stable, or change more slowly, often linked to environmental cues. Humans seem to be constantly riding a wave of these powerful, fast-changing internal states, with no visible system to keep them steady. The Vigil's databanks filled with records of these emotional events. They categorized them based on the energy signatures and outward signs. State: high energy, positive vocalization, happiness. State: low energy, negative fluid release, sadness. State: volatile, high-energy aggression potential, anger. State: sharp spike avoidance response, fear. But the labels didn't explain why these states changed so readily, and often without a clear, logical trigger. A sudden change in weather didn't reliably cause sadness. Finding food didn't always cause happiness. A challenging task could cause frustration in one human, determination in another, or indifference in a third. The Vigil reviewed their knowledge base of other life forms across the cosmos. Most species they had observed had some form of built-in or environmental control over their core functions and behaviors. Some planets had atmospheric compositions that naturally promoted calm states. Some species had biological systems that released natural chemicals to prevent extreme internal swings. Others lived in societies with strict rituals or psychic links that kept everyone on a steady keel. They had what the Vigil mentally catalogued as environmental regulators or mental stabilizers. These weren't tools or machines humans used, but natural parts of their world or bodies that kept things stable. But the humans of Earth seemed to have none of this. Their planet was environmentally diverse and often chaotic. Their biology seemed to allow for massive, unmanaged swings in these emotional states. They had no natural calming gases in their air, no shared mental link to smooth things out, and no internal biological switch preventing them from becoming overwhelmed by anger or crippled by sadness. It was like watching creatures trying to navigate a choppy sea in tiny boats with no anchors or rudders. The Vigil found this deeply inefficient, even alarming. Their initial observations, meant to be a simple cataloguing of a new species, were revealing a level of internal variability and apparent lack of control they had previously thought impossible for a dominant life form. They concluded Chapter 2's data collection with a growing sense of unease. These humans were proving to be far more dynamic than anticipated. Back in the silent, humming interior of the Observer, the Vigil Collective began the hard work of making sense of their findings. Data streams flowed through their linked minds. Billions of observations, smiles, frowns, shouts, quiet tears, sudden jumps, still silences. Energy readings spiking, dipping, then spiking again. They organized the data into categories. They looked for patterns, for causes and effects. If a human lost something valuable, they often showed signs of sadness. If they achieved something difficult, they showed happiness. These links were clear enough. But what about the times a human showed intense anger because another human used certain sound waves, words, they didn't like, or experienced deep fear just from thinking about something that might happen in the future? These didn't fit the simple cause and effect logic the Vigil understood. Their central processing unit, a vast network of pure logic, struggled. It kept flagging the same anomaly, the severe lack of internal stability mechanisms in the human biological design. The Vigil compared the human data to their records of the Chronosians, a species who lived in perfect synchronicity with their planet's slow, steady energy pulses, which regulated their moods to a constant state of calm focus. They compared humans to the luminoids, beings of light whose forms naturally filtered out disruptive energy frequencies, keeping them stable and peaceful. They compared them to the geobuilders, creatures who lived deep underground and whose biology was regulated by the Earth's steady core temperature and magnetic field, preventing any emotional extremes. All these successful, stable species had natural regulators. They didn't choose to be calm. Their environment or their very bodies kept them that way. But humans seemed to have nothing like this. The Vigil's scans showed complex chemical reactions happening inside human bodies during emotional states, spikes of things like adrenaline or cortisol during stress or fear, floods of dopamine or serotonin during happiness or excitement. But these chemicals seemed to be the emotions, not something controlling them. They were the storm, not the anchor. The Vigil found records of humans sometimes using substances to try and change their internal states. Things they called alcohol or drugs or medicine. Some seemed designed to dull strong feelings. Others seemed to enhance them. But these weren't natural biological regulators. They were outside agents, often used inconsistently and sometimes causing even more unpredictable behavior. It was like trying to calm the choppy sea by pouring more water into it. What truly baffled the Vigil was that humans often seemed to seek out situations that caused these dramatic emotional swings. They would watch moving images, called movies or shows, designed to cause sadness or fear. They would gather in large groups to yell and cheer during competitive events, sports, that caused intense excitement and frustration. They would intentionally expose themselves to loud sounds, music, that triggered various strong states. Why would a species willingly destabilize itself? Why embrace the storm instead of seeking calm waters? It made no logical sense. It was inefficient. It was dangerous. The Vigil Collective processed this new information. The absence of natural regulators, combined with the apparent desire for intense, fluctuating states, painted a picture that was deeply troubling to their logical minds. The data was pointing towards a conclusion that went against everything they understood about stable, predictable life forms. The logical minds of the Vigil found this lack of inherent stability deeply concerning. In their long history of observing life, they had learned that predictability was key to survival and cooperation. Species with stable internal states built stable societies. Their actions could be anticipated based on logical needs and consistent responses to environment. But humans? A human who was joyful one moment could be furious the next, for reasons that weren't always clear. A human who was calm and logical could suddenly be crippled by fear based on an imagined future event. How could you predict the actions of a species whose internal state was like a constantly flickering light, sometimes bright, sometimes dim, sometimes erratic? The Vigil observed humans making plans, setting goals, and creating complex systems. But then they would see individual humans, or even groups, suddenly abandon these plans, make illogical choices, or act against their own apparent best interests, all seemingly driven by these powerful, uncontrolled internal states. A leader might make a decision based on anger rather than logic, affecting thousands. A sudden wave of fear could cause widespread panic and chaos. An overwhelming need for excitement could lead to reckless, destructive behavior. From the Vigil's perspective, this wasn't just inefficient, it was dangerous. Not just to the humans themselves, but potentially to anything that interacted with them. A species that could shift so rapidly and unpredictably, driven by internal storms they didn't seem to control, and sometimes even seemed to invite, was a species that could not be reliably interacted with. Their reactions to any given stimulus, friendly contact, a simple exchange, a shared challenge, were impossible to guarantee. The data was conclusive. Humans lacked the biological and environmental regulators common in stable species. Their internal emotional states were volatile and prone to rapid, unmanaged fluctuations. And worst of all, they seemed to accept or even value this chaotic internal landscape. This understanding was the core finding of Chapter 3's analysis. It wasn't just that humans had emotions, it was that they had them in such an extreme, unregulated, and unpredictable way. This realization would form the basis for the Vigil's final assessment. The data was analyzed, the anomaly was confirmed. Humans were, by the Vigil's standards, inherently unstable. With their understanding of the missing regulators, the Vigil began Chapter 4 of their report. This section focused on the results of human emotional instability, their unpredictable actions. They observed a human meticulously building a small, complex structure out of tiny pieces. The human worked for a long time, showing great patience and focus. The vigil's sensors registered a steady, calm state for hours. Logically, the human should continue until the structure was complete. But then, the human made a small error. The structure didn't break, it just didn't fit perfectly. Instantly, the human's face twisted. Energy readings spiked dramatically, showing frustration and anger. With a sudden violent movement, the human swept the entire structure off the table, scattering the tiny pieces everywhere. This action made no logical sense. The error was minor and could have been easily fixed. The result of the emotional spike was the destruction of hours of work. There was no threat, no need for aggression for survival. The anger state overrode logical behavior. They saw humans interacting in groups. A conversation would be happening, sharing information, a logical exchange. Then, one human would say something that triggered a strong emotional response, perhaps hurt or indignation in another. The triggered human would stop the logical conversation and launch into an attack using sharp sounds, words, sometimes bringing up unrelated past events. The goal of the interaction shifted from sharing information to causing emotional pain. The vigil saw leaders of human groups making decisions. Instead of relying purely on data and logical outcomes for the group's benefit, decisions were clearly swayed by the leader's current emotional state. A fearful leader might avoid necessary action. An angry leader might start conflict unnecessarily. A greedy leader might harm the group for personal gain driven by an intense internal desire. These emotional factors seem to add a layer of chaos to even their most organized systems. They watched humans engage in something called relationships. Two humans would show signs of deep affection and happiness when together. They would share resources, protect each other, and cooperate closely. Logically, this beneficial arrangement should continue smoothly. But then, a sudden surge of jealousy or suspicion, often triggered by small, seemingly unimportant things, could cause massive conflict, breaking the bond and leading to behavior that was harmful to both humans. The sheer variety of human emotional expression and the intense swings were unlike anything the vigil was prepared for. They saw moments of incredible empathy and compassion, where humans went to great lengths to help strangers for no logical reward, driven purely by a feeling. They saw moments of pure malice and cruelty, where humans intentionally caused suffering for reasons that seemed to stem from deep, dark, internal states, completely without logical justification. These observations reinforced the vigil's growing conclusion. Without the steadying influence of natural regulators, human actions were not reliably linked to logic or predictable external factors. They were slaves to their internal emotional storms, capable of shifting from great kindness to extreme cruelty, from focused work to sudden destruction, all based on invisible, unpredictable triggers within their own minds. This made predicting their behavior over any length of time almost impossible. The vigil had observed countless other species react in predictable ways, introduce a threat, they show fear or aggression. Offer a resource, they show interest or contentment. Their internal states followed a relatively stable script, influenced primarily by clear external events or basic biological needs. Humans, however, added a wild card, the intense, unmanaged surge of internal emotion. A human might react to a threat with courage, a form of intense, controlled energy, or panic, intense, uncontrolled fear. They might react to a resource not with simple contentment, but with overwhelming joy or jealousy if another human had more. The intensity and variety of these reactions and their sudden shifts made it impossible for the Vigil to build a reliable model of human behavior. They compiled data showing how these unpredictable actions impacted human society on a larger scale. Projects abandoned due to sudden despair. Conflicts started over perceived insults driven by pride or anger. Resources wasted due to impulsive decisions made in moments of excitement. Acts of great sacrifice performed out of intense love or duty. From the Vigil's logical, order-focused perspective, this was not just chaotic, it was fundamentally illogical for a species seeking long-term survival and stability. A species whose individual members could become instantly volatile and whose collective actions were so easily swayed by invisible, unmanaged internal forces was a species living on the edge of constant, self-inflicted disorder. Chapter 4's data proved that the absence of regulators directly resulted in a level of behavioral unpredictability that the Vigil considered extreme. It wasn't just a quirk, it was a defining characteristic of the human species. As the observer continued its silent watch, the Vigil's processing core began preparing the final section of their report, the part where they would assign a formal classification to the life forms of Earth based on everything they had seen. Within the observer, the Vigil Collective processed the final report. Chapters 1 through 4 laid out the findings clearly: initial observations, the strange fluctuations, the missing regulators, and the resulting unpredictable actions. The logical processors hummed, sorting through the massive dataset. The consensus formed quickly, a shared understanding solidifying within the collective mind. Based on all observed data, the species designated humanity on planet Earth exhibited a level of internal instability rarely seen in dominant life forms capable of building complex societies. They lacked the natural environmental regulators found on other worlds that gentle moods. They lacked the biological stabilizers present in other species that prevent extreme internal swings. Their emotional states were volatile, powerful, and changed rapidly with little predictable cause or pattern. This lack of internal control directly led to behavior that defied logical prediction. Decisions were made based on fleeting feelings, not consistent reason. Actions could be wildly beneficial or senselessly destructive, often shifting between the two without warning. They could build wonders in moments of collective hope, then descend into brutal conflict driven by hatred or fear. The Vigil had a classification system for all observed life, based on factors like intelligence, technological capability, and, crucially, stability. Stable species were predictable, reliable, and safe to interact with or learn from. Unstable species were volatile, unreliable, and posed a potential risk due to their unpredictable nature. Based on the overwhelming evidence, the Vigil assigned humanity its formal classification. The label echoed through the silent ship, a cold, logical judgment based purely on data. Species designation: Humanity Planet. Designation: Earth. Classification: Type Delta, high instability. Assessment: dangerously unstable and unpredictable. The report was finalized. The observation mission regarding initial classification was complete. A species without regulators, constantly tossed by internal emotional storms they couldn't control and sometimes even seemed to encourage. A species whose next action, driven by joy, sorrow, anger, or fear, was fundamentally unknowable. The Vigil rerouted the observer. Direct interaction was not advisable with a Type Delta species exhibiting high instability. Further observation from a greater distance would continue, but the primary conclusion was set. Humanity, the squishy, feeling creatures of Earth, were officially marked in the Vigil's galactic catalogue, not as inherently evil or good, but as profoundly, fundamentally unpredictable, a beautiful, chaotic, and potentially dangerous anomaly in a cosmos that favored order and control.